Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Georgia's signature lecture series sponsored by the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources today. I'm Dale Green, and I serve the Warnell School as Dean. I want to first take this opportunity to thank the faculty, staff, and students on the Warnell Diversity Committee for recommending today's speaker. The format for today's lecture will be a presentation of up to 45 minutes, followed by a 5-minute intermission. Dr. Jesse Abrams, Assistant Professor of Natural Resource Policy and Sustainability, will then moderate a question and answer session until 5 p.m. Please type your questions during the presentation in the Q&A folder, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. It's now my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Carolyn Finney. Dr. Finney is a storyteller, author, and a cultural geographer. She is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. She's grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of learning and knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, she returned to school after a 15-year absence and completed her BA, MA, and PhD. She has taught at Wellesley, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Kentucky. She has served 8 years on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board, and she's currently in a residency in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College as their Environmental Studies Professor of Practice. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. We are delighted to have an opportunity today to hear from Dr. Carolyn Finney as she discusses what's race got to do with it, Christian Cooper, John Muir, and the nature of green space. Dr. Finney, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to hearing your comments today.
Dr. Green, thank you for having me here. UGA, thank you for coming to my apartment. That's what I said to everybody earlier. I can't believe I can fit you all in here. I wish that we were really face-to-face, but I'm glad we're having this moment. I want to thank Jesse Abrams for reaching out, because this has been going on for months. We've been, thinking about how could we reimagine my visit with you all. And I want to thank all the students who had me on their list and invited me to speak with you all today. I'm really excited. I'm more excited about the conversation we're going to have than what I'm going to say, but that's just because what I'm going to say, I say it a lot. Hopefully you will find it resonant. So yeah, let me share some slides, because I like to have my images up here when I'm talking. Okay, I see what we have to do here. One second, everyone, not yet. This is a moment. Okay, now I can share. Okay, it's coming. Had to get it in the right order there. All right, here we go. What's race got to do with it? Christian Cooper, John Muir, and the nature of green space. I just really like this image by Red Van Empel. I'm going to start on this slide. So this may seem like it has nothing to do with this conversation about race and the environment, but I'm hoping a lot of you have been watching Lovecraft Country on Sunday nights on HBO. No, I'm not getting paid by HBO to actually pitch this show. I actually think this show is the best thing on TV right now, and that's saying something, because I like to watch a lot of things. But there's a reason why I want to talk about this show in relationship to the conversation we're going to have today. So I'm not going to give away any spoilers. I'm just going to tell you if you were reading a little bit about the show, what the show would tell you and why I'm bringing this up. So the show is set in the 1950s. It's right after the Korean War. It kind of focuses on Chicago, but moves to Massachusetts. So it's back and forth between those two places. But it's based on a book by H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft, if you look up his little description about who he was, he's an American author. And they literally say he wrote weird fiction, horror fiction, and science fiction. I didn't even know there was a thing called weird fiction. But now that I've been watching this show, I can see it, right? So horror, science fiction, magic, witches, the whole 9 yards in this show. Now that's not unusual. There are a lot of movies and a lot of shows out there that kind of focuses on horror and fantasy and sci-fi and all of it. And some of them even try to do it all in one series. The thing that's really revelatory and revolutionary for me in this show is that it centers on Black characters, you know, having the experience, right? So it centers on this kind of, everybody's not directly related, but it's kind of a family who makes a journey. That's all I'm going to say without giving anything away. This is part of the journey when some of them in the car. That's not unusual. It's actually like Indiana Jones crossed with Tomb Raider when you see it, when you see the film. The thing that's really incredible about this, one, it's the horrors they face. So the horrors around, there are literally monsters in the woods. There's witchcraft, there's magic, there's some gore. I mean, all of it is there. But it's the everyday and ordinary horror of racism that they also prioritize in the telling of this story. So you see this family when there are a few of them get together and they're like, okay, we're going to drive from Chicago to Massachusetts because we got to find out, you know, about this legacy and this history, and we got to find our missing relative, and all this stuff is going down and there's magic. And as they're all piling into the car, a woman who's staying behind says, well, let's go over the checklist to make sure you have everything you need in the car. It's very casual. She's talking about, you know, do you have blankets? Is there food? All the things that you need to have. This is what the Green Book was about, because if you're Black driving across this country in the 1950s, you better have everything you need in the car, because there's a good chance you won't be able to stop anywhere along the way, to stay in a hotel, to rest your feet, to maybe go for a walk in a nice green area, all those things. But they don't, it's really, the way they do it, this isn't a movie about racism, but you cannot tell a story about Black people in America without considering racism, right? And that is the beauty of this story. So suddenly you have characters who are universal in many ways in terms of their humanity and fighting off scary monsters, which they're doing all the time. But then there's an image where they get stopped by a white state trooper who tells them that they have 7 minutes because they're in a sundown town and they better get out. And that's before the monsters come from the woods. So it's the horror that they're facing of the monsters, and there's the everyday horror of racism. And episode after episode, I'm just floored by the way they've woven it so seamlessly in a telling of who we are in this country, and the question of race, mobility, space, green space, and it don't matter if it's green space or not, right? That it's also green space there. And how do we hold that everyday horror about the Black experience? And I would venture to guess it's not only about the Black experience, that everyday horror. Oh, it's so good. Oh, it's the final season. It's the final show this Sunday. I'm very upset. So I want to sort of back up a little bit more and talk about, for those of you who watch Lovecraft Country, my reference to I Am will make sense to you. But here I always want to talk about the subjectivity of perspective. And it's not because, like Miss Jane Pittman, I just want to talk about myself and tell my story. I do this all the time, but it is strategic and it is intentional, because if you do not understand your own positionality in relationship to the question of race and the environment, you know, racial injustice, whatever, social inequity, whatever it is that you want to talk about around this conversation, if you do not understand your own positionality, then for me, you can't really fully dive into the change that's needed. Because for me, I believe the first change that's always needed is the change at home. It's internal, and it's the work that you can do. And me, like everybody else, is biased. Everybody here is biased. I'm biased. Bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's what I call the subjectivity of perspective. I believe we come to know everything in the world through our own eyes, right? This is a picture of me, 1962. I'd recently been adopted. That's my dad on this estate, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. This work for me is personal, it's professional, it's political, it's everything. I think about, I want to look at my notes here and make sure that I say this. I can never be incognito. That's what I always say, right? I'm always Black. Whether I'm walking at a job, whether I'm hiking, whether I'm outdoors, whether I'm indoors, whether I'm in an institution, whether I'm in an organization, whether I'm in the grocery store, I can't get away from it. I can't get away from it. I'm not saying that I'm trying to, but it's always there. And in this country, that shows up in a very particular way. That means something. It's embedded in the foundation of who we are, whether we recognize that or not. I think about Christian Cooper. You know, Christian Cooper, the self-identified gay Black man bird watcher, is in Central Park, you know, to bird watch. He has his skin weaponized against him by Amy Cooper, a white woman, who then I just read yesterday that there was a second call recently released that she called back to say that he was threatening her. So it didn't just stop with her initial call to the police, right? That no matter what it is, what you talk about him, after that, they talked about him being gay. They talked about him being a bird watcher. They talked about him, you know, going to Harvard. They talked about him sitting on the board of Audubon. And two things are true for me. One, he's still Black, and it doesn't matter. And two, and it shouldn't matter. If he was homeless with no formal education and not a dime in his pocket, it still shouldn't matter. Neither should that person get stopped either because they are Black. The point is, you can be anywhere on the continuum. And when it happened to Christian Cooper, and a couple of days later, George Floyd got murdered, and when I wrote that piece for The Guardian, the point that I was making is those two incidents are on a continuum. They are not wholly different. And many of us occupy spaces on that continuum all the time when you talk about moving and mobility in America. And just because you're talking about the environment, just because you're talking about outdoor spaces doesn't change the conversation. You just have to get more specific, right? And about what's implicit in the conversation and the narrative about the environment in this country. I was thinking, well, yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. So I always have to tell my story, in part to get you to think about your own story as well. These are my parents, Rose and Henry. Rose, this picture's from the 1950s when they were young, fresh, and ready to go. My dad had just come back from the Korean War. They lived in Floyd, Virginia, which is where they grew up. They grew up poor, they grew up Black. They grew up with a high school education. They still Black, still have only that high school education. And when my dad came back from the Korean War, he talks about he saw a park ranger uniform he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. And he thought that looked like a great government job. So he said he went to apply for the job, and what they told him was, I'm sorry, we don't hire Negroes. My father has since always harbored something against the National Park Service. So they moved north, like a lot of Black people did at that time. They were part of the Great Migration. They came to New York. My father got 2 job opportunities. One was that he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. But the job he ended up taking was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. A very wealthy Jewish family owned a 12-acre estate, and you're seeing some of the photographs here of that estate. Beautiful. There's a lake, we called it a lake, a pond, a swimming pool, woods, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, flower gardens, stunning. My parents were full-time caretakers for this estate. So the house you're seeing there is the gardener's cottage that we lived in. I'm not showing you the house. There's a bigger house, which I'll show you in a second. My father was the gardener. He was the chauffeur. My mom was a sometime housekeeper on this property. I tell everybody that this was a very wealthy, all-white neighborhood except for us. And it stayed that way pretty much until the 90s. For a brief period, a Japanese-American woman moved in, and then she moved out. When I say wealthy, excuse me, Harry Winston had property down the street. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived next door. Wingfoot Golf Club was literally 2 minutes walk around the corner from where we lived. So there was a lot of wealth in this neighborhood. I didn't think much about it directly as a kid till I was about 9 years old. I mean, I could show you videos and all these things of, I just uncovered some videos from the 70s of my family, playing outside, rowing on a boat on the lake, learning how to swim when we were really young, really having the advantages of building a relationship with non-human nature. It was like our own private park because the original owners were usually only on this property on weekends and holidays. So we were on this property full time. But I like to tell the story that when I was 9 years old, walking home from school, so I went to a public school, Mamaroneck Public School. I was right around the corner from the house. And there were always policemen, patrolling this neighborhood because there was so much wealth. And I remember getting stopped by this white policeman in his car. And he asked me where I was going. And I gave him the address. I said, 1000 Old White Plains Road. And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm thinking, dude, I'm 9. But I didn't say that. I said, "No, I live there." And so he let me go. I went home. I told my parents. My father got so angry, he called the police station, and he really gave them hell about it. That's what I remember, you know, what he did. He gave them hell, and they never bothered me or my brothers again. But as an adult, and this is a story many of you heard many times over, pretty much every day in the news now, about some Black person in some position getting stopped for doing what seems to be very ordinary activities. Walking home from school, I had all the signals were there, right? The school bag, you know, how young I looked, all the things were there, the time of day. But I have to question the logics. What were the logics in that man's mind? I will never know exactly what was there, but here's what I understand about the history of our country. That has been the logic since the founding of this country. I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to jump ahead now until the 90s. So at this point, one of the owners, it was a couple, the patriarch had died years earlier. The matriarch was now very ill, and she wanted to think about what was going to happen to my parents, who've been caring for this land at that point for over 40 years. And to her credit, she wanted to try to keep them on this land. And what I tell everybody is that this land at that time in the 90s was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My dad had only been making $20-something thousand a year. And even if the original owner was willing to pay for all that, which her family in the end decided that isn't what they were going to do, it would have been hard for my family to stay here. So she had a house built for them, a very beautiful house in Leesburg, Virginia. She passed away. She passed away with my father by her bedside. It's complicated. And the new owner moved on in the late 90s. My parents stayed on till 2003 because the new owner needed to find people to live in this house full time. Somebody has to be caring for this land day in and day out. And eventually he found a family that was originally from the Dominican Republic who moved in. When my parents moved to the house in Virginia, beautiful house on about a half an acre of land, I watched my father in particular get incredibly depressed. And he talked about missing the land. I mean, that was just really the thing in his head, missing the land, and also feeling like there was no legacy of land to pass down to myself and my brothers. My parents received a letter, and it's a copy of a letter that I carry around with me from the Westchester Land Trust. The letter had been sent out to all the people in the neighborhood to let them know that a conservation easement was now going to be placed on this piece of property. When a conservation easement is placed on a piece of property, that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. It talked about all the environmental values of that property, the wildlife on that property, all the flora and fauna, where it sits in the watershed. All the pictures it's about a page and a half, the letter, about all the reasons why this land should be protected in perpetuity. At the end of the letter, it thanks, the Westchester Land Trust thanks the new owner for his conservation mindedness. He'd been on the land for about 3 years. There was nothing thanking my parents who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years. And just that fast, I saw my family, my parents' labor, and not only their labor, their love was erased. And that's really when I started thinking about all the people in the history of this country whose experience of the outdoors, land, ocean, beach, the city parks, the forests have been erased, have become invisible. It doesn't mean that they're not there, but what is it about the dominant narrative around environment in this country, the way we've built curriculums and policies around how we want to think about that relationship where they are not seen? And so that's where my bias is embedded. You know, I understand it's deeply connected to ideas of belonging, home, race, power, privilege, identity, and who gets to claim and name these spaces? Who gets to simply show up as their whole selves and never have to think twice about what that is, right? And when you go back, think about Lovecraft Country. Think about, there's a new documentary that came out on PBS a few days ago, Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America, which really, you know, connects it back to slavery to really understand that this was no accident. This is the backside of I called it the big house, and you can see the pool and the pond was right in front of that lake. And there is now a wrought iron gate on that driveway there. It wasn't there when we lived there. And my family, a few years ago, we tried to get in, to visit, and we couldn't get in on the property. And so for many of you, especially those of you who look at natural resources, who think about the environment more broadly, maybe you're looking at, Bureau of Land Management, the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, all of these agencies, this idea of public lands belonging to everyone. I want to ask the question, what public are we talking about? Are we talking about, well, I'm going to leave it like that, ... Are we talking about? I also want to talk about, at this moment, and I like to talk about this idea of convergence, right? So I've been thinking a lot about a friend of mine, an older friend of mine and wiser friend of mine, talks about the year of 2020 being about 2020 vision. What do we see that we haven't seen before? Well, let me rephrase that. What do some of us see that some of us haven't seen before? Because that's actually a very different question. Again, I believe all of this has always been there. So I love John Oliver. Last week tonight on the news, John Oliver is my TV boyfriend. He doesn't know that, but I think he's so funny. He's so smart. And lately he was talking about what he called the fracture around race in this country. And he gave this whole monologue. And at the end of it, he said, we got here on purpose. This is no accident. This is no accident that we're standing here today. I put all of these photographs up here because they're just a few, just to point to the convergence of this moment with our past. Wherever we go, there we are. The whole idea of past being prologue, and I would say past being prologue and being present here. The idea that when slavery was happening, you have slavery, Japanese internment, immigrants of all walks of life, particularly from south of the border, as well as Asia and Africa, always being challenged. We have always created exclusionary policies for different kinds of people and how they came over here. Oh, what? I left out the two main things, the two main truths here. One, yes, we built the backbone of our economy on Black people that we enslaved to work the land for free. But more importantly than that, all this land was stolen. All of it was stolen. Stolen, there was genocide committed. We removed Native people from the lands. It is an uncomfortable and very real truth that I would argue we are all accountable to in a very particular way, but that's just my point of view here. I like to put these pictures up here because I put them up here. You see up there on the top line, there's a famous picture of John Muir with Theodore Roosevelt. Is it Theodore? Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt, 1903. Overhanging Rock, Yosemite National Park, right? I imagine this is it's a famous picture and an important conversation. Here was a man that was thinking about ideas of conservation and preservation. Here were two men thinking about ideas of wilderness. Now, I'm not interested in diminishing their ideas, right? Because I've been impacted both positively, negatively by those ideas. I think we all have been. These were two very committed men to these ideas, right? Gifford Pinchot's over there to your left, right? 1897, I think that picture is from. This man came up with the whole idea of forestry, forest management, conservation, managing the resources for our use. Also another very thoughtful and committed individual. For me, I have to ask the question, at the bare minimum, what else was going on at the same time? How was the stage really set at that time for them to stand there and have that conversation in this way? This is why I always go back to the Homestead Act of 1862. And I tell myself, before this, I looked at this work, I never thought about the Homestead Act. And actually, I think it's one of our most important pieces of legislation because it changed the way we relate to and think about land. And it's all about land. We can talk about natural resources till the cows come home, and we cannot have that conversation without talking about land. And to understand that when that gun went off at midnight, for mostly European immigrants of European descent, when that gun went off at midnight, you could go out, you could put your stake down on 160 acres of land. And if you stayed on it for 5 years, if you farmed, if you built a home and just stayed there, that land was yours free and clear. And I want you to think about that, right? Because that is about legacy. That is about the right to be able to say you belong. It is about economic and political power. It is not simply about land. It has never simply been about land for land's sake. And while I'm not interested in diminishing the experience of European immigrants, many of them who didn't want to leave their own homes, who were forced to leave. I don't want to diminish the very human activity of dreaming of something better for yourself and your family. And much like the characters in Lovecraft at that very beginning, taking off on that adventure and being able and willing and courageous enough to do so. I actually don't want to take away from that experience, but I can't help but ask the question, who had to be removed from that land in order for them to have that experience in the first place? And who's accountable for that? How do we hold that? You know, a few years later, Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're given 400,000 acres of land to potentially do the same thing as many of the European immigrants. And a lot of the white plantation owners, when they got together, there was this brief moment during Reconstruction where you had Black men in politics, like it seemed like it was gonna be a new day. And then you had a lot of white plantation owners that said, I don't think so. Because land is about economic and political power. It is about legacy. It is about the right to claim, your ability to belong and say that you are here. We can't have that. We're gonna take all that land back. 40 acres and a mule, we're gonna take all that land back. And while you did have some African-American homesteaders, nowhere near the number of people of European descent, you know, nowhere near the number of immigrants who were of European descent, who were able to claim that land for their own, who now talk about, in some cases, themselves as being Native Americans, as being people who've been here the whole time. It's complicated. So I asked the question, what is it that we're trying to sustain when we talk about questions of sustainability? And I always like, if you could see it, you know, if I could do it, I'd make my eyebrow go up like that, because I always get, you know, it's a word. What are we trying to sustain? Sustainability for me is about relationship. It is about relationship to non-human nature, land, water, air, all those things, plants, trees, flowers, animals, all those things we talk about, all those things that a lot of our movements are embedded in. But it is also about our relationship to each other. It is about our relationship to people. And that, my friends, is a really complicated and complex relationship. Because with 2020 vision, when we start to look at it and understand the foundations, I'm not saying we are all bad, all good, not a useful conversation. We are human beings, right? We are human beings and we are complicated and complex, but we have to be able to see the whole picture, because right now it is in our face, and it is in our face in a really big way. You know, I love that James Baldwin quote, and I know it's overused, you know, not everything that can, gotta move my little picture here so I can see it, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced over and over and over again. So as an example, sorry, click this just right. This is something I like to share that's more contemporary. This is from an experience from a couple of years ago. You may have heard of Vanessa Garrison and Morgan Dixon. They started the largest nonprofit in the country that focuses on Black women's health. It's called Girl Trek. And central to their efforts and their mission is getting Black women in the outdoors, hiking, walking, experiencing non-human nature, all the health benefits that non-human nature gives to all of us, actually, if we can access it and use it. And a few years ago, I would say this was probably around, I don't know, it's been a few years now, maybe 2016 or so, 2017 or 2018 even. She posted this on Facebook, and I want to share with you what she posted. She posted it from Rocky Mountain National Park. She was there with a group of Black women that she had taken out hiking for the weekend. Vanessa Garrison posted this. September 5th, at the time, in Estes Park, Colorado. When I have a little more time to clear my head, I'm going to write a longer piece about being pulled over in the national park while I was driving a van full of Black women down the mountain after experiencing a magical hike together. I'm going to tell you about the park police officer who approached my van with his hand on his gun and demanded I roll down the back window so he could see who's inside. I'm going to tell you how he accused me of being drunk, asked me what I was doing in the park, and then told me if I cooperated, he wouldn't give me a ticket. A ticket for what, I asked. Driving too close to the car in front of you. That's a crime in Colorado. I led 3 advanced hikes over the course of 3 days this last weekend. I've personally brought hundreds of Black women to Rocky Mountain National Park over the past 4 years. I've organized trips at every park in the country, inspired thousands of more to take a step in the great outdoors. I was on the cover of Outside Magazine. I starred in a Christmas commercial for REI. I partnered with the Sierra Club to train outdoor trip leaders, was named a Yosemite National Park ambassador, and yet this man was asking me what I was doing in the park. Asked me while still holding his hand to his gun, despite seeing our hiking gear when we rolled the windows down. Asked me what I was doing there as if he wasn't standing on stolen land and I was somehow trespassing. This is why I turn down opportunities to speak on diversity and inclusion in the outdoors. No, I don't want to be on your panel. No, I don't want to write an article or give a quote. No, I don't believe that things are changing. Diversity and inclusion? How about decolonization and reparations? When you want to talk about that, I'll be ready. In the meantime, we'll be back to the park next year, thinking we'll bring 1,000 Black women this time. Thinking I'll pack a fried chicken sandwich and wrap it in foil and eat it at the lake next time because I can. Thinking I'll listen to some Tupac while I take in the views. Thinking I'll do whatever I want because I can. Because I have a right to be there. Because you won't scare us off. I belong here. We belong here. We can talk about that later. I don't want to comment more on it. I think it has its own weight and power on its own. So I call this my metaphorical afro. And this is just a little transparency from me to you, that I carry a lot of things around up in my head around this subject, and I can't fit them all in my afro. You know, front and center right now, the murder of George Floyd, the coronavirus, which all of us are experiencing and living through in very particular ways. But a lot of people influence my thinking, and it doesn't mean it's not everybody is Black. It's people across the line. Some people because they're smart, some people because they're funny, some people because they have something to say that really resonates with me in very particular ways, and I carry around with it all the way. Sometimes I carry people around in my head I wish I didn't, but they're there just the same. And just so you should know, I did have an afro, and we won't linger there. So I wanted to pull just a couple of things out of the book, only a couple of things today, because I'm pulling together a lot of different things that I want to make sure we have conversation, but I wanted to seed the conversation in a very particular way. So jungle fever, I call this jungle fever in the book. I was thinking about issues of representation. I was thinking about a lot of different kinds of images, and a lot of different kinds of issues. And I often put up these two issues, and these images of, the first is the Vogue magazine, I believe it was 2010, first time they put a Black man on the cover, and they put the amazing LeBron James, who just won Lakers go. Okay, that's an aside. The amazing LeBron James with the supermodel Gisele Bündchen. And when this came out at that time in 2010, a lot of Black people got incredibly upset by this image, not because it was LeBron James, but they said, it's the first time you put a Black man on the cover. Why does he look so primitive and like that? Why couldn't he have looked more elegant and more dignified? And then someone uncovered this poster next to it, which was from 1917, right? Now I went down to the color of her dress. The editors of Vogue said they knew nothing about that poster. And actually, I really don't believe that, but even if they didn't know, for me, it raises a question about what's buried in our consciousness around these issues and how it shows up over and over again. I think about, let's go back to the World's Fairs, right? In the late 1800s, when we had World's Fairs in this country, it was a way to show new ideas, innovation. Where do we want to go as a culture? Where do we want to go as a people, right? And Black and brown people were put on display as the things we should want to move away from, right? So we started there. We actually started earlier than that, but we started there in many ways in terms of engaging the conversation about who it is that we want to be at any one time. I think about Oda Banga, a young man who was discovered in the Congo, a young African man who was brought back, who was put on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And I love that museum. It's the first museum I've ever gone to. Love that museum. The museum owners decided that not enough people would see him, so they moved him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo until enough people protested. but the damage had already been done. And there was plenty of stories like that. They saw him as the missing link. So that's why they were putting him on display also as this thing that we want to move away from in terms of who we want to be. I think about when our self-identified first African-American president went in the White House, and if you looked around the news, the things that people were saying out loud, when conservative pundits were saying things like Obama's Planet of the Apes, when he did passed the stimulus bill, there was an image in the New York Post. Sean Delonis had drawn a cartoon of a dead chimpanzee with stimulus bill pinned to his chest, with two white cops standing over him with smoking guns. The pictures of the White House with the watermelon patches in front. I mean, it went on and on and on, right? I think about the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act. You know, actually, I never thought about the Wilderness Act until recent times. But the Civil Rights Act, I kind of understood that would have some impact on myself and my family in a very particular way at the time, right? They were passed in the same year. I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of the fact that you had two very thoughtful and motivated groups of people who were having conversations separately about what seemed to be separate issues. Civil Rights Act is a little bit better at talking about space. The Wilderness Act uses universal language to talk about how we should be with wilderness. And there's so much assumption embedded in it. And what I always like to say, privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. Howard Zahniser and his people aren't bad people. I'm sad that Howard Zahniser died before he got to see this bill passed. The commitment is real. But that universal language, who is the public? Who is the we? It was 1964. I'm sorry. Where are you living in this country? And what color is your skin? And how much money do you have in your pocket? And what kind of political access do you have? And what do you think is actually going on? Right? Do you think it makes any difference because you're talking about wilderness? And again, let's not even bring Native people into the conversation because they definitely have something to say about it, right? It's really complicated. The last thing I want to say about this is to show you, again, how complicated it is. And the story that I always like to tell in the book is that in the late, I guess it was 1950s, early 60s, when all the protests and everything are going on, there was a white professor out of Boston College who was friends with this African-American couple. And they wanted to go to a national park, but because they were Black, he said, you know, it might be better if we go over the border to Fundy Bay National Park in Canada. But he wrote the superintendent there because he wanted the superintendent to understand. He goes, I'm bringing this African-American couple. They're very cultured. They're educated. I want to make sure that they're treated with respect. First of all, that he felt he had to write the letter, you know, in the first place, right? When he finally heard back from the superintendent apologized and said, I can't make that promise because we get a lot of American visitors here. The couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, who wanted to take a break from their civil rights work to do what Howard Zahniser and his people were saying should be the right of the people to find spiritual solace, to find a place to rest, to find good health, like the women of Girl Trek. The things that we tell ourselves we are all allowed to do. And somehow we think we're going to do that with not attending to a past and the pain of that past that is lived every day for so many people here. You know, for me, how can we do better? Finally, from the book, I just want to say the question of memory, right? And how the question of memory is embedded in all of us, right? And I talk a lot about collective memory and how African Americans in particular may hold that. But the story that I tell that seems to have impact for people is about my father and about the individual, about us spending time in Atlanta, Georgia in 2005 when I was working on my dissertation and got my parents to visit me. And I said I was going to take them to Dr. Martin Luther King National Historic Site. And my father really didn't want to go because, again, the national parks, but I said, we're going to do it. We're going to have this Black national park experience. We walk in, my mom wanders off. There's a whole exhibit going on of images or dioramas around. There are sounds coming over the speaker, Dr. King's voice and police rioting. You are supposed to be inundated with your senses at that moment. My dad, who's a stoic man, who doesn't show any real emotion beyond anger, this is my interpretation of it, of course, was standing next to me and he suddenly grabbed my arm. And it scared me because first I thought I was 10 years old again. And then it scared me because I looked at him in his face at blanched and I thought the man was having a heart attack. And then right after that is what I tell people is that the man giggled, and that really freaked me out because my dad does not giggle. And then he pointed, and what he pointed to as part of the exhibit was a sign. And the sign said, "For whites only." My father pointed to the sign. He said, "I saw that sign, and for a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to be here." He was grabbing my arm to get me out. And 40 years had come back on him just that fast. So I think about the memory that so many people carry, but I actually think about the memory that we all carry that's buried very deep in our DNA in terms of being in this country and in this place. Before I end, I want to talk a little bit about John Muir. I'm not going to be able to say much because I can see I've only got less than 5 minutes left, and somebody can ask me about this, about 2020 vision and John Muir. You know, that article a few weeks ago came out in the Washington Post, "Liberal, Progressive, and Racist, the Sierra Club Faces Its White Supremacist History." And I thought it was great broadly. A lot of us have been saying this a really long time. Now, I'm not interested in wholly denigrating John Muir. You know, the thing is, we are not collectively good at addressing the complexity in any one human being, right? To understand, the man was racist, in his own words. Read A 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867. There are quotes in there that are in between the quotes where he is just able to observe and really value and appreciate non-human nature. Is the same breath he can talk about the ugly Negroes and the lazy Negroes, and he goes on and on and on, right, about that at the same time. That actually is one of the best examples of who I think we really are than the other, which actually tries to pretend none of that exists. We don't see color, right? We don't see color, and how problematic that is, right? And for me, and somebody could ask me about this in terms of the one-woman show, I wanted to imagine what it would be like to be in conversation with him. To be in conversation with him, because his policies and his ideas have actually impacted me. And it is not about my story or his story, it's actually about our story collectively, and that I get to choose what that is. He doesn't get to choose for me. But it's not about erasing his, I'm not interested in the cancel culture, I'm just not. Actually, for me, all of those are missed opportunities. And I believe everyone should be held accountable and responsible with an eye towards what is it that we want to reconcile and what is it that we want to do differently and better. So lastly, I will say, Lastly, I will say that it's, for me, and I always say it's about a question of risk, and there are many of us who are risking all the time, every day in every way. What I'm talking about are those who are thinking about, what can I do differently? What can we do? How does it look? And I said, well, first of all, you have to be able to take a risk in order to gain. Not a risk because you're afraid of losing something, not because you're trying to hold on to something, but a risk because it's a leap of faith that you actually believe that I want to gain something that I don't fully yet understand, but I actually want to take a leap there. And it is not about being comfortable. This is not about anybody being comfortable, because some of us have never been comfortable. A few years ago on NPR, Michelle Martin interviewed Svetlana Alexievich, who had just won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. And she's from Belarus. And when she was interviewing her, what was so amazing was that Michelle Martin was saying to her, you know, you've made a lot of your own people uncomfortable, and they're really angry at you, because it was like she aired the dirty laundry about what Belarus did wrong. And basically what Svetlana Alexievich responded with was, I love my people, but I'm not interested in my people being comfortable. I'm interested in my people being better. So the last thing that I want to say, I know I said that was the last thing I want to say one more thing. It's very short, right? I wrote here, I said the past is prologue, and the prologue is present. So I told you that story of me at 9, which had to be like 1969, okay, when I got stopped by a cop on the way home, right? A few months ago, there was a story online about a 15-year-old Black girl named Breonna Nelson Hicks. She lives with her grandfather in a very wealthy white neighborhood in Wellington, Florida, and she was walking with 2 white friends home. I think she was right in front of her house, actually. And there's a video of an older white man yelling at her, telling her that she doesn't belong there, that she doesn't belong there. Breonna, like the characters in Lovecraft Country, have to slay monsters every day. And some of those monsters you can see, right? They come out of the woods, they're obvious, and a lot of them are. That's partly, in a very broad brushstroke way, is what systemic racism is. It's in everything, right? And every day, so many of us have to duck and weave, but I think we all lose in the end. So I wrote here, she's ducking and weaving through a hostile landscape, and she's doing it with her head held high. Our very humanity is at stake, y'all. The horror is real, but so are the possibilities. So let's talk about what we can do. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Finney, for that thought-provoking and very interesting presentation. I know that will prompt many questions for our upcoming question and answer session, which will start in 5 minutes after this brief intermission and will be moderated by Dr. Jesse Abrams. So thank you again for that very informative and thought-provoking presentation. We look forward to the Q&A session.
All right, welcome back, everyone. My name is Jesse Abrams. I'm an assistant professor at the Warnell School and at the Savannah River Ecology Lab. And I will be moderating the next 40 minutes or so of discussion with Dr. Carolyn Finney. And so as I mentioned earlier, as the Dean mentioned earlier, these questions will come from a combination of questions submitted by students in the seminar course, Warnell seminar course, and from questions that were raised in the Q&A box during Dr. Finney's talk. And so I've been sort of monitoring those, taking some notes. I'll continue to monitor as we go forward, and we can continue the conversation. So let's see. Thank you so much, Dr. Finney, for that amazing talk. That was inspirational, moving, and informative all at the same time. I'd like to start with a couple of questions from our seminar students. And maybe one that I think flows pretty nicely from some of the themes that you already touched on.
Yeah.
And that's to ask about yourself and sort of your champions in this field of natural resources. I think it's fair to say that recently there's been a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations that kind of, I think, track well with what you talked about in terms of kind of problematizing some of the maybe two-dimensional perspectives we have on some of these heroes of the conservation movement. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience, who you saw maybe initially as heroes, and how that relationship has changed, and whether you've come to maybe recognize some less popular individuals as being leaders in conservation?
Yeah, that's a great, no one's ever asked me that question before. That's actually, that's a great question. Well, you know, so I will be honest with you, I'm not the person who thinks of people so much as heroes, but I do, because I have a problem with the word, but the people that revere, for me, you know, a lot of who I thought about was really early on was Jane Goodall. And it was because back when, you know, I was doing all that backpacking, and there was a period of time, the only kinds of books I was reading for the better part of 5 years was books having to do with individuals who would, you know, walk across Australia for 9 months with 3 camels and their dog, or they'd climb a mountain, or they would sail around the world. I was just so interested in people taking those leaps of faith for themselves and experiencing the world. But the other was that I was looking in particular, I never found any books about Black people. This was late 80s and the 90s, you know. So I was often looking to women. So I'd read about men as well, but I would look for women. And there were so many good stories about the work that, I didn't read the academic texts. I was interested in the story behind the person. And there was so many interesting stories about, you know, how Jane Goodall got started. The idea that she was actually a secretary in Nairobi, Kenya, you know, and Louis Leakey, you know, saying to her, you know, maybe you could go spend some time with these chimpanzees, and how she turned that. I mean, she went to school, she did the thing and did all the work. And actually and I've seen her speak, and it hasn't changed any way that I look to her in terms of that worship of what she's done and her commitment. You know, for me, it's not about somebody always getting it right. It is about, you know, being able to change, but also the intention has always been clear. You know, that there's a degree of transparency. It's not about people not making mistakes. You know, the reason that I've never held John Muir up, but I lived in California for 8 years. In Northern California. You can't live in Northern California in the Bay Area without John Muir coming up in your face. And I served on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. I had never thought about John Muir before any of that. I really didn't. You know, I had heard of him. I didn't know anything about him. I grew up in New York, right? And so what I've come to understand and why I want to be in conversation with him, because it's a set of ideas and a set of ideals that I want to challenge more than I want to challenge him as the person. And to understand, for him to have that kind of privilege, for him to be able to sort of place himself in conversation in that way was in part, yes, his own chutzpah in doing that. But this whole idea that it was entirely about pulling himself up by the bootstraps, for me, I'm not buying. You know, he was a white man living in a very particular time in history. He was friends with the president of the United States, right? You know, and he was a committed, smart, and intentional human being who had some ideas about what it is he wants to do. So for the thing for me is that I look at people, we can have a conversation about integrity, authenticity, the ability to admit when one doesn't know what they don't know, the ability to stay committed. I mean, I have a lot of contemporary people that I can just name, Audrey and Frank Peterman. Maureen Betch is so Zora Neale Hurston and Maureen Betch. Maureen Betch is the beach lady that I talk about in the book, who gave all her wealth away to environmental causes. And I was very fortunate to be able to engage with her. She's one of the most important people in my life. And she's no longer alive. She died back in 2005. When she said to me, I am the freest person you will ever meet. When you gave away the money, when I gave away the money, I was able to do exactly what it is that I wanted to do. And she lived what she believed in. And that's the aspiration for me personally. What does that look like for me? Not to be like her, but actually be willing to risk in order to gain, to actually live what it is that you say. And there's nothing easy about that. John Francis blows me. When I met John Francis, John Francis, this man spent 22 years walking across the US to raise environmental awareness, and he did it for 17 years without talking. And he is like a gentle giant if you ever meet him, and his commitment was full. Was it perfect? Probably not, because nobody's perfect. But it was this attempt, this risk to say that I'm going to do this thing. I have no idea where this thing is going, but I know how I feel about it. And so I'm just going to see what emerges. I mean, those are the people that I look to. Ron Finley. I haven't met Ron yet, but Ron is on my list. This man is building on highway medians. He's just doing his thing. And I'm not saying that because he's got a great TED Talk. I mean, he was doing that stuff before somebody said, oh, we want you to do a TED Talk. I know, and I believe without ever meeting him, that what he's motivated by is not the celebrity. What he's motivated by is the work. Right? And that he understands that for his community as well as for himself. So I once had a boyfriend, that's a whole nother, and don't worry, I'm not going there, and he loved jazz music. And I used to really piss him off, as I might do right now to some people, when he'd go wax on about Miles Davis, right? Miles Davis is brilliant. I am not about to take Miles Davis down. I just needed to remind him that he was also a domestic abuser, that he beat women. So my question is, not that we cancel Miles out, but how do we hold that complication? The appreciation of his brilliance doesn't have to lessen, but how do we hold him accountable for what else he did? And so that's why for me, the conversation with John Muir is, I want to have a conversation with you. I don't want to cancel you out. I couldn't do it if I tried. What you offered to the conversation about the environment is embedded in curriculum since I was in kindergarten. I was a Girl Scout. I went all the way to cadets. So the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, all of those have benefited, or not, from John Muir. And it's in me whether I like it or not. But for me, is I also wanted to hold him accountable for his racism. I also want to remind him of his privilege. And I also want him to listen to the fact that myself and my family also have something to say about this environment, whether he wants to listen or not. And we're not going anywhere.
Great, thank you for that. And I'd like to, if you would mind, continue that conversation a bit. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this about your one-woman show about the
Oh,
2020.
Jesse, you're so good, man. You were like, she wanted to talk about it. Let me bring it in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to hear more about this conversation with John Muir.
Yeah. So in 2016, which was the year, 100-year anniversary of the national parks, a lot of you might remember the big centennial. There were a lot of things going on at that time, and I was on the advisory board at that time. And also as a geographer, so every year was the annual geography conference, thousands of people. And this year, the person who was president at the time put together a plenary session, and he got about, I want to say 7, 8, 9 geographers from different parts of the field, of the discipline, and asked us all the same question. Is John Muir still relevant? Was the question. And we all had 10 minutes. And so I remember as I was like preparing for that, like, what should I say? What am I going to say? And what people thought I was going to say, which was, like, write the dude off, environmental justice, power to the people, however, whatever the expectation was. And actually I decided that I wanted to put together a little piece. And so I came in, I entitled my piece, I called it The N-Word, Nature Revisited. And I said, I started thinking about John Muir. And I started thinking about one of his books, A 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867, when he decided to walk the landscape. The South wanted to see the impact of war on the landscape. He kept a journal. It was eventually published. And as I was thinking about his book, I was wondering about what it would be like if a Black woman had written it. And I partly got the idea because back in the early 2000s, Alice Randall's a Black writer. At the time, she was at Harvard, I believe. And she thought the same thing about the book and the movie Gone with the Wind. So Gone with the Wind, about the antebellum South, romanticizes it, in my opinion, in a very particular way. She thought, what if a Black woman wrote it? And so she wrote a book, and she called it The Wind Done Gone. And she wasn't trying to be funny, but she said it was written from the point of view of Scarlett O'Hara's, as she put it, mulatto half-sister. The Margaret Mitchell estate went insane, and if you try to buy the book now, it has to say a parody on it. She was just forced to put that on there, even though it's not. But I started thinking about it, A 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867. So part of what I wrote is a few lines. I said, I'm going to call it A 1,000-Mile Walk Was Rough in 1867. And the character was going to be Sojourner Washington Douglas, was the woman. And what I did is I took real quotes from Muir's book, things that he would talk about in terms of the beauty of the landscape, as well as his racist remarks about Black people, and I would intersperse them. So I'd read those comments and I'd say the years that it was happening. For him, it was basically 1867, 1868, right in that period of time. And then I made up comments from Sojourner Washington Douglas, but I pulled from actual historical facts. So I kind of made up the fact that she was born on Magnolia Plantation, doesn't know her actual real name. This is her nom de plume, Sojourner Washington Douglas. I talked about her ducking and weaving through a hostile landscape. I talked about her not being light enough to pass, therefore she had to keep to the backwoods, but that was pretty scary. I talked about the real lynchings that were taking place in Colfax, Louisiana at the same time. And the only difference is I pushed it right up until 1940. And so when I hit 1890, I just said, Jim Crow is the man. 1900, Jim Crow is the man. 1910, Jim Crow is the man. And I just kept going till 1940 when I said she passes away and Jim Crow was still the man. And so I sort of left that there for the audience just to compare the two, right? You don't have to take one away to be able to see the other, but just to understand those are two very different experiences of the same landscape. Right. Then I started to think about the book Rap on Race. And Rap on Race, if you haven't read it, is an amazing transcribed conversation between James Baldwin and the anthropologist Margaret Mead. Oh, two very different people, two very smart people who took the time to sit down with each other and have this conversation. And I was like, what would be the mini version of me having that conversation with John Muir? And so I wrote just a tiny little scene, because remember I had to keep it in 10 minutes, right? So I just did a tiny little scene and I made it kind of funny how I invited him over in my apartment. At that time I lived in Lexington, Kentucky. And I invited him over and he was looking kind of shocked to see me there because maybe he expected me to be cleaning his house, but no, but he was polite. He sat down, I served him green tea. I started talking about my role in the advisory board. And I started talking about Shelton Johnson, who's this amazing real life Black park ranger in Yosemite. He's been on Oprah, and I was thinking that in my head. I'm saying it out loud, but I better not tell John Muir about Oprah. That'll really freak him out because he don't know who Oprah is. And I kind of just made this way through a conversation where he didn't have a lot to say because he was still trying to process what was happening, that he was having this conversation with me and I was serving on the National Parks Advisory Board. And then I end and look at the audience and say, at the end of the day, it is not about, the question for me is not whether John Muir is still relevant. The question for me is, how is John Muir still relevant on my terms? And I mean that to be true for everyone. So we don't have to cancel him out. But if you just ask me, I have a point of view about it, as I'm sure everyone else does too. And so jump ahead to this moment, and part of the residency at Middlebury is supposed to give me time to really think about what would a one-woman show look like, to really, pull that out into an hour-long or an hour and a half, piece that you're actually doing. And so I'm doing some stuff with the New York Botanical Gardens. The great-great-grandson of John Muir, Robert Hanna, said he would help me. We did a podcast a few weeks ago together. There's a lot happening right now. There's an HBO film director who is wanting to tell the story of me and my family on that estate because she saw me speak somewhere in Telluride. There's a lot of things kind of doing this, you can feel it coming together. And I can't talk about it too much, but that's where it's embedded. And of course, in this larger moment that I simply don't control like anyone else, suddenly this stuff is up in a really big way, right? This moment, the racial lens is huge, right? And everybody can be seen. Everybody can be seen right now. So I'm also looking at how to tap into that in a real and authentic kind of way with my own voice.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. Really something to look forward to. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask one more question from the students in the Warnell seminar course. And it's a tough question, but I think you'd be a great person to provide some insights on this. So, as you mentioned, these conversations about race, racial violence, exclusion, these are everywhere these days. And yet, I think it's also fair to say that it's difficult to have these sorts of conversations today without pretty quickly finding this culture divide kind of dominating the discourse, right? That people tend to quickly go to their corners whenever confronted with this sort of a difficult conversation like this. So do you have any insights as to the best way that we can have these conversations? I mean, you've already said you're not a fan of cancel culture, that you think we need to kind of engage and discuss it rather than to try to cancel. So any other insights about how we have these conversations in a way that's productive and doesn't just kind of reproduce that division that's already there?
Yeah, that's another great question. And you're right, it's a hard one. And I'm always thinking about this. So my preamble to answering the question is that I'm only in academia part-time. I left full-time academia a few years ago because of a lot of the reasons that we're talking about here. But I love working with people in academia, but I needed my freedom in order to feel like I could wholly show up, right? So it was also an act of self-care in order to do this work. The residency at Middlebury is part-time by design, because the rest of the time, and I've been building this for a few years, it's a public platform, I'm usually on a plane every week flying around because somebody's invited me in to have these conversations. COVID happened, not getting on a plane. And then Christian Cooper, George Floyd's death happened and everything. I'm busier now than I've ever been, and I'm not going anywhere. It's like I'm here on this black box all the time. And so part of what I do, some of it's giving talks, but a lot of it's running 3-hour workshops. Now it's with outdoor retailing companies and other kinds of businesses. And I mean, I could go on, major environmental organizations, small ones, community groups, people who are trying to do what the question is asking, like how do we have these conversations? And so I'm thinking about this all the time. And so I don't have one straight answer. Part of it depends on, so I always say to people about doing their own work first. It doesn't mean you can't do these things simultaneously, but there's also something about the internal work. What is your own story, your own positionality? What is it that you bring to the table? What is your intention or set of intentions about why you want to have the conversations in the first place? And you have to be honest about that. Are you having the conversation because you really believe deeply in some kind of change? Are you having the conversation because you want to make sure that that you can signal to everyone that while you do not see yourself as racist and you don't know what else to do, but you want to make sure you're sending the right signal, which none of this is bad. I'm not judging it. I'm saying there needs to be a clarity. And what is your aspiration? The aspiration is not the same as the intention. It really isn't. The aspiration is that thing out there that what do we aspire to? Knowing that we have to stand where we are right now? And what is your capacity to actually meet that aspiration? What capacity? What is your skill set? What is your willingness? Who might you co-collaborate with to make that happen? The question for me is not being afraid to come to a conversation. Look, I tell everybody right at the beginning of any conversation is, I'm not interested in whether or not you agree with me. My intention is not about coming to an agreement over something, right? My intention is actually to create a container that allows each of us to show up wholly as we are, honestly, with transparency, but maybe develop a set of agreements about how we might like to move forward. How do we do that with respect, thoughtfulness, and even a little fun can be thrown in there somewhere. Joy is a real thing too. Asking different kinds of questions. Wouldn't it be interesting if you got a group of people together and the first thing you asked them was, what is it that you love? What is it that you're afraid of losing? These are these are directly related to the questions of social and racial inequity and injustice. But don't ask those questions. Ask the real things that real people fight for and work for every single day and experience. And then you start to really listen to what the answers are. And it's really interesting. This is why story can be so powerful as a practice and as a tool, right? That you can ask people to be willing to tell that story about what they're afraid of losing. To tell that story of what it is that they love. And then you start to develop common ground and common language. Sorry, I got emotional about it. Common respect for, what it is, for who they are, why they might have a different perspective than you about something. And you usually discover something you didn't know about them. And they often discover something about you they didn't know. And it doesn't mean that both of you are suddenly changed and are necessarily going to vote differently because of that. You might, but that's not actually the goal. The goal is past the election. The goal is past that. It's like the aspiration is beyond that. The intention's at the moment, but there's something greater there that we've forgotten who we are and where we stand, and the gift of being able to even stand here and have this conversation now. It is yet another opportunity in 400 years to have a conversation that we have been having for 400 years. How many more people have to die because we still haven't figured out how to have this conversation? So for me is, be willing to fall on your face, be willing to have people get angry with you, be willing to have people cancel you out, be ready to lose membership, and be ready to gain all the things you can't see, what emerges about who you are, your own confidence, your strength, the people you haven't met yet, the access, the lift up, what will be revealed. When I think about Mommy Betch giving away all of her money, she gave it all away. She was living on the beach for a while. To her famous academic sister bought her a trailer to move into. She didn't have to do that. She was living pretty damn comfortably, even for a Black person. What are you willing to do? Walk into that room, walk up to that person. When you make a mistake, when you microaggress, when you say that thing you didn't realize was going to hurt somebody, the question is not, that you did it, the thing. Is what do you do after you do the thing? How do you intend to the good intentions of your impact? It's showing up again, and you might have to show up 4 or 5 times before that trust is developed to let you in yet again. That's what we do well as human beings, right? You're gonna make a mistake. You're gonna make multiple mistakes. It's not like I haven't made them when it comes around difference and people. Of course I make them. I'm a human being. Right? But it's how I show up afterwards and keep showing up and doing the thing anyway. And sometimes, the thing about cancel culture, I think is embedded in there, is the idea that sometimes we just have to take a break from the thing. So I don't think cancel culture is ultimately useful. Because what are we going to do? Cancel everybody out who ever made a mistake? Well, ain't going to be nobody left in the lifeboat if we do that. Right? So, but there is, I think, important to recognize when one needs to step back, right? When one needs to say, okay, at this moment, I can't take anymore right now. I can't listen to that person anymore right now, because for my own self-care and my ability to keep in this conversation, in this fight, in this moment, I have to step back. It doesn't mean you don't hold somebody accountable. But how do we hold somebody accountable? Do we pull on the old tools of oppression that have been used by the oppressor for the last 400 years? Or do we come up with a new way? Something that's a little more generative, something that holds someone accountable but doesn't push them away. When Alice Walker wrote the book Color Purple, one of the reasons I love that story, one of the reasons I love it is because my aunt, it was the first time I was given a book when I was young, when it came out, that a Black girl was like at the center of the story. I couldn't believe it, right? But also, when I got a chance to see, a number of years ago, it was on Broadway. And after the show, Oprah got on stage to talk about the brilliance of the production, and then she invited Alice Walker on stage. And Alice Walker didn't talk about herself at all, but she talked about the fact that the story is about reconciliation. No matter if you like the movie or not, but the story, even in the movie, the story was not simply about, it was about a lot of things, but also about a Black man played by Danny Glover who beat and raped women. But it was what happened afterwards. What happened when he got pushed away, but then he was called back in. The powerful moment in that story is the calling back in, right? The courage it takes to call somebody back in that has hurt you, the trust that is inherent in that. What do you imagine if we all started doing that with each other? That for me is where we're at. That is the opportunity right now. I'm a crybaby. Don't be, it's emotion and passion, and I'm stuck in my chair, but yes.
Thank you so much for that wonderful answer.
Yeah.
That was moving and really an amazing vision for how we might move forward collectively. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Jesse.
Maybe I'd like to follow up with a question here from Sydney Woodruff, who wrote in on the Q&A that I think you may have spoken already to part of the question around accountability.
Yeah.
But then Sydney also asks, how do we ensure momentum? At the same time, we might see people starting to opt out of these conversations or lose interest. Yeah. How do we ensure that accountability? I mean, I think as you said, this conversation has been going on to some extent for 400 years, and yet we also are in a moment where there's a spotlight on some of these things in ways that, at least in my lifetime, feels new. From my experience, feels new.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we prevent this from just being a moment that passes?
Yes, and it's a great question. Thank you, Sydney. So the first thing that popped in my head is about the role of some people leveraging their privilege. So, if I think about academic institutions as one example, it's not the only example, but there are people, who are in positions who are more protected than others. And yes, you're right, Sydney, my experience has also been there are already people who opt out of the conversation, right? I don't want to use the example of something I was just in, of people, you look and see who shows up. If they're not required to do so, they don't show up for a variety of reasons, which doesn't make them bad people, but privilege has a privilege of not seeing themselves. So when they don't feel like they don't have to show up, or they don't want to show up. How do you leverage privilege? What is that? What does that look like if you're in a position of power? I don't know. Is it making it a requirement? Is it about working it into the system in a very particular way that makes it really difficult to avoid? Is it rolled into the way that people get rehired or people get promoted? Is it in the curriculums? I mean, I'm thinking academically, but it's not only that. I think we all can think about the privilege that we have. We all don't have the same privilege, but we all have privileges. And how do you leverage that? Is it in who you know? Are you the one who brings it up every time when it really needs to be brought up? Are you the one? This is why I say the risk is always you might lose membership because you're the one who always does it. But that's the decision. It's in many ways, at one scale, it is an individual decision. There's also the collective, and that's why collaborative efforts and coalitions, you can be supported in that. But it often starts with the individual decision. What are you willing to risk? Are you going to continue to be the person who says something when something needs to be said, even if you're not exactly sure what that is? And no one may hear you in that moment. And then you still say something again. Are you the person who's always going to be writing something, or at the meeting, at the board meeting, or at this meeting, or at that meeting? You know, when it's time a year from now to hire, to make a new hire around this, when it's time to think about what knowledge counts and what we're going to put on the curriculum, when it's time to consider who we're going to ask to engage, when it's time to think about how much money someone gets paid for the work that they do around this, when it's time to consider all those students who feel unseen because of their difference, right? You know, the work isn't going away. Yes, Jesse, I think I hear what you're saying, that in this moment, there seems to be a loud collective, you know, there's a huge movie camera, you know, everywhere right now on everybody. And it won't always stay there positioned in quite that way. But the stuff that's happening will still be there. You know, the work is ongoing. There's no end date. There's no end date around engaging change, or engaging difference, excuse me, and engaging difference well. That's a process and a practice. That's life. It's for life. It's for life. So maybe part of it is also how we're thinking of new frameworks, new pedagogies, new ways of instituting and supporting that kind of change, that engaging diversity and difference for life as a life practice. Maybe some of the ways we've been doing before haven't been working. They haven't been. Some of them, right? And it's time to consider new ways without forgetting, you know, from where we've come and what we've built the foundation of knowledge making on, right? Yeah, I could say more, but I'll stop there on that one.
Great, thank you for that.
I hope that was helpful, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe shift focus a little bit here. We talked a bit about John Muir.
Yeah.
Let's maybe talk about Christian Cooper for a moment. We had a question here from Jennifer Roberts about the Central Park incident, and kind of alluding to the history of Frederick Law Olmsted and John Muir. I think interestingly, and I'm just going to sort of ramble here for a moment, but I think it'll be relevant, that there's something I think important in that when we look at the creation of Central Park, obviously it's seen as this sort of accomplishment in the sort of grand narrative, the sort of white dominated narrative of the conservation movement in the US. And at the same time, we know that it was built in what was a thriving Black community. People were displaced, lost their homes, and there's very little recognition of that. John Muir, you already mentioned. And interestingly, I think my sense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that both Muir and Olmsted, if you had asked them at the time, would have felt that they were progressive, right? That they wouldn't have seen themselves as necessarily racist. And I think there's maybe a connection to what we saw with Amy Cooper, right? That that this is maybe someone who wouldn't self-identify as racist, right? Yeah. Yet we sort of caught this moment on camera, or saw this moment on camera that represented so much of exactly the kinds of issues that you talked about. So I guess my question coming out of all that is there some continuity here? Is this the idea that the past is never past? And is there something particular about that Christian Cooper incident that's resonant, even in a year that seems to be flooded with these images of violence and discrimination?
Yes, I would say to all of that. So I'm thinking, I should have written something down there, but I was thinking about, so Amy Cooper, you know, so let me back up a little bit about, so a good friend of mine who's both Black and Indigenous and older makes the kind of case that she doesn't actually believe anybody can be racist, which doesn't mean that they don't practice racism, because it's the system that's racist that influences people, right? So it's a different kind of conversation. I'm still chewing on it a little bit, right? But let's just say for a minute, that's, you know, the framework that I want to start from, right? That actually no one individual is racist. They can practice racism though in a very particular way. It's because the system has allowed them to be so. Because I also read that Amy Cooper said she's a Democrat, and all the ways within which, you know, nobody likes to be labeled a racist, right? Nobody likes to be called that. And if I'm super, super generous to her, I would say that actually, one, you know, the fault for Amy Cooper is in part is that she got caught on camera. She's certainly not alone in that kind of behavior, one. Two, that it says something about what's embedded in our consciousness, in our subconsciousness, that her impulse was not to say, I'm going to call the police, a man is bothering me, you know, I'm threatened by this man. She could have used the, you know, traditional gender role thing, you know, but she was very particular. It was like African-American man, that somewhere, you know, she doesn't have to know it consciously, that she understood that that would create a picture of a threat that would be recognized, accepted, and supported, right? And if we understand early on in American history, the way that collectively white women, women of European descent, have been seen as, in many ways, as property, but also as something to protect and support. She's just pulling on an old, that's an old heartstring, an old history string there, right? And actually, I thought about her inability to feel chastised by a Black man who was saying to her, you need to put your dog on a leash because it's affecting the bird life here. That I'm wondering at most fundamental wasn't about the racism, was just about she didn't like to be told what to do by this stranger. Like, dude, you're telling me I can't do what? I can do what I want to do. That kind of old American individualism, that we are free to do whatever it is we want to do. And how look at all the people now who think not wearing masks is a patriotic choice, right? That's, all of these things aren't unconnected to me. Without talking to Amy Cooper, I can only sort of guess at that. I actually felt a little bad for her to lose her job. She lost everything, you know, that many of us would at a time during a pandemic, right? So to look at that, and maybe it will, hopefully she's been looking in the mirror and doing some hard talking. But if I told you conversations I've had some with people I know, like people I know, and some of the stuff they're saying, and I can see that they haven't got a clue that what they just said, how it landed on me, they haven't got a clue what that is, and what do I do with that, right? If there isn't, the thing that people have heard me say is that I refuse to relinquish my own humanity as we move forward. I am not afraid of being angry. Some students in my class the other day, one student said to me, he said, are you empathetic with everybody? And I said, nobody's ever asked me that before. I said, and then another one said, well, what about anger? I said, oh, you all clearly don't know me well enough. I said, I'm angry a lot. I'm angry a lot. I have no fear of anger. Anger sometimes drives the car in terms of driving me to where I want to go, but I cannot let it control my choices. Anger doesn't equal hate, right? Anger does not equal violence. Anger for me equals power. It equals passion. It equals clarity. It equals a way for me to know exactly where I stand and what I am angry about, because then my job is to articulate it, communicate it, and do my best to change it, right? But I don't have to get violent with you, or hopefully I don't, right? In order to get there, right? In order to get there. So when I think about Amy Cooper, I don't want Amy Cooper to go away in a cave. Because if we send all the Amy Coopers away in the cave, what do we got, folks? And I know maybe that's what some people want, but that's not the world I want. I actually want Amy Cooper to do the work. Do the work, Amy, and come on back into the party, but do the work. I would like to know that she apologized to Christian Cooper, not publicly, but privately, that she apologized. Do you know how many people I wish would apologize to me? I got so many stories. Recent ones. The apology is the thing. It starts there, because apology equals, real apology is about recognition. And it points to the very possibility that now you're ready to do the work for change. And it points to the possibility that we can actually have a relationship, a working relationship around this, and have a conversation. Woosah.
So much. That was excellent. What a fantastic answer. Unfortunately, it looks like we're just about out of time for our question and answer session. So I want to thank you again. This has been a fantastic experience for myself, and I know for so many who joined the call here. I want to just let everyone know briefly that we have recorded the video, and we've also we'll have the video with captions available in a few days on the Warnell website. I also wanted to point people, we had a few questions about where they can continue to engage with your work and your creativity. And I would say certainly your website is a great place to start, carolynfinney.com. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that in terms of other resources.
You know, I am, as someone with no infrastructure and everything's kind of exploded, I tell people, you know, feel free to email me. You may not hear from me right away because I'm doing everything myself. But I appreciate your interest, mostly not so much of your interest in me, but your interest in this journey. And I really want to thank you all for being on that journey, because for me, we're only going to do this if we're all doing this, if we really want change. And so I also want to thank Jesse and Dale, Dr. Green and Dr. Abrams for inviting me here today and making it possible, for Brent for making sure that you could see me technologically, for the people doing the transcription, everything. This has been great. The only thing that would have been better is that we would have been in person. Let's hope that that's in our future for all of us. And I hope everyone takes care at this time and takes care of each other as well.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Finney. We're giving you a big virtual round of applause.
Yay!
You may have a hard time hearing it from Vermont.
Yes.
We look forward to future collaborations and conversations. Thank you.
Yes, I love it. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.